The Equal Rights Amendment was the talk of the town, and Ms. was specifically a feminist title. It's something that you chose because I'm not a miss, I'm not a little girl, and I'm not a missus, I'm not married to somebody. I'm an independent woman. And we had Ms. Magazine, run by Gloria Steinem, and the cover of Ms. Magazine #1 had Wonder Woman on it running for president, right? Well, what
Yeah.
was Ms. Marvel's secret identity? She was a writer for a women's magazine. She was Gloria Steinem in tights, which was awesome.
I want to leap over buildings, want to fly over the shores, save the people from the villains, catch the crooks who rob the stores, write my name upon the sky, and when you call me, I'll be there, faster than a lightning flash, rushing through the cool night air. So start ignition, count to 0. I just wanna be a superhero.
Hello, darlings. It's me, your unquestionably lovely host, Eva Webb, and welcome to Titular Characters. I'm here today with Dr. Comics himself, Jason Tondro, author of the Deluxe Supervillain Handbook, Superheroes of the Round Table, and Arthur Lives for Fate Core. And we're here to talk about superhero costumes from the Golden Age to the MCU, what makes them tick, and so much more, I'm sure. Let's get into it.
So let's go back to the beginning. There's a couple of very important themes that show up in superheroes from the very start that help to make the costume what they are. Now, there's a lot of historical influence that goes into these costumes. Anybody who's very interested, I might point you to Jess Nevins' book, The Secret Origin of the Superhero, I believe that it's called. But when it comes to the comic strip or the comic book, if we look at someone like Superman, and we're like, okay, why is his costume the way that it is? Why is Superman's costume the way that it is? And what are those elements? Well, he's got the symbol on his chest, he's got the cape, he's got the boots, he's got the trunks on the outside of his pants, which seems really distinctive, right? And the colors are important, the red, blue, and the yellow. Okay, and it's all very skin tight. Well, one of the things that is very important in all this is the simple bad print quality that the comic books were originally printed in, right? Like the printing presses, the newspaper printing presses were not exactly high resolution, right? And so you just didn't have a lot of room for detail. I mean, you try to draw some kind of fancy, elaborate clothing with layers or flowing clothing or anything that's got like wrinkles in it or folds, and none of that's going to show up. It's just a mess on the page. So that's one factor. Bad resolution, right? Bad DPI, if we think of it in that way. Secondly, speed. The economics of comics in 1938 were based on making a lot of them very fast and cheaply. The young New Yorker guys, or like the guys in St. Louis or whatever who got paid to make these books, were on an assembly line kind of process, and they did this stuff very fast, and they got paid not much money, right? So the way that they would make more money was not by getting more money out of their publishers, who were not going to pay them more money. The way to make more money was to do it faster, so that you could do more pages and get paid more money because you were paid by the page, right? So, again, speed. Well, now you can just draw a human figure, and you can draw like, okay, a couple of little lines make gloves, a couple of little lines make boots, a couple of little lines make belt, and you're mostly there, right? And you didn't have to spend a lot of time drawing an elaborate costume. Third factor, the circus. I know it sounds weird to us now because when we think of the circus, we think of something like Cirque du Soleil. Many of us have never been to a circus. But in 1938, when Action Comics #1 hit the stands, Everybody who looked at the cover of Action Comics #1 knew exactly what Superman was. He's a circus strongman. He's wearing every element of the circus strongman outfit. The tights that accentuate his physique, the boots, the cape, the symbol. It's all straight out of the circus strongman playbook. Today, we associate that costume with superheroes. But in 1938, that was a circus outfit. And this also explains the trunks. Why is Superman wearing trunks on the outside of his pants? Well, that's because in 1938, tights were made of cotton, and cotton sags, right? You have to wear trunks on the out. This is a circus outfit or an acrobat outfit, something that you might see. You would like an ice skater outfit, and you would wear the trunks on the outside of your tights to keep them from sagging, right? None of this stuff is relevant today. Today, when we have like these, form-fitting costumes that are made exactly for the actor, none of that's relevant. But this is how a lot of this stuff initially gets formed. Does that all make sense so far? You follow me?
I'm totally following you. This is fascinating. So to go back to your point about the cost of production with comics, that's why artists like Jack Kirby and Wally Wood were so popular, was because they could draw very, very well, but also very, very quickly. And that's what they were known for.
Yeah, that bit where I was talking about how the artist can't get a raise, so they just draw more pages per day. Well, this was exactly Kirby's strategy, and he was never shy about talking about it, right? Like, he would try to get more money out of Stan, and Stan would claim he couldn't pay him more money. So Stan would actually encourage him to draw what we would call the splash page, right? If you're a comics fan, you know what I'm talking about. That's just a page where the entire page is one big panel. Well, that's very fast to draw. That's a lot faster to draw than drawing 6 or 9 little panels. And Kirby basically invented the splash page so that he could draw more pages faster and get it was a raise. It was a way for him to give himself a raise.
Kirby's splash pages also had a lot going on in them. More than splash pages you see today. For example, I was looking at one, and there were like 25 characters in it, and there was Galactus, and there was Dr. Doom and the Fantastic Four, and all of them just in this one gigantic, glorious panel.
George Perez does these wonderful splash pages that I could just watch all day long, right?
Oh, yeah. George Perez was awesome.
But costumes. We came for costumes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Hey, I can nerd out all night. I'm down.
Started off as a sort of circus strongman kind of thing.
Yep.
But it sort of evolved into something else. You went from Superman to Batman to the Flash, and then gradually the costumes start changing and evolving during the Silver Age, but they still have the same kind of formula to them.
Well, I think that what you see here is there's a lot of influence from artists who were wanted to make a living as graphic designers, right? They wanted to be doing magazine illustrations, for example. And so they start to bring design elements to the comic. And, you start to get kind of not so much a second generation, but let's call it a later generation of kids who maybe were reading some of those early comics in the 30s. And so that by the time that we hit the Silver Age, and we get Neil Adams' design of the Green Lantern, for example. And these costumes are very different, and they're intentionally kind of a redesign and update of the costumes that they're based on, the legacy characters they're based on from the Golden Age. I'm fascinated by a lot of this stuff by the use of color. That red and blue and yellow sort of that are the primary colors of the printing process at the time are used for most of the heroic characters. But if a character is an evil character, then they get purple and green and orange, right? And so this is how you can tell that a character like Hawkeye, who ends up becoming a hero, but of course is introduced as a villain, as a kind of circus criminal thief who eventually turns good. But his costume is purple. The Hulk's anti-hero qualities fit perfectly with his purple and green color scheme. And you can see Marvel is kind of creating its characters after a lot of these rules have been set down by DC in the 30s and 40s, and so Marvel can kind of respond to all of those. As I'm sure you probably already know this, and many of your listeners probably do too. But of course, originally the Fantastic Four weren't going to have costumes at all. Stan Lee made a point. He didn't want them to have costumes. He wanted it to feel at least a little bit more real. I mean, if anything in these comics are considered to be real, but they were just going to wear regular clothes. And that's a big deal in the first issue, right? With the Thing kind of walking around in this big overcoat and stuff. But the fans, the readers wanted costumes. Like that was part of how they recognized these characters as being superheroes. They had to have the costume. And so Kirby comes up with that brilliantly elegant kind of blue and black design with the fours on the chest. But that was a later development, and it was something that I don't think Jack or Stan wanted to do until the readers kind of really, really asked for it.
The Fantastic Four costumes are great. They're so simple. They're so beautiful. And I loved the way they explained them as always fitting like over somebody like Mr. Fantastic who can stretch his body infinitely, or
the
the Human Torch, the unstable molecules, exactly. It was such a great solution that I think it really actually sort of defined the characters almost.
I love that bit when Byrne took over the Fantastic Four for a while, and he inverted the color scheme on their outfits, right? You remember when he did that? So that it was all like a really, really dark blue, almost black, except that their gloves were white, and the four symbol was all inverted. Really interesting ways that you can keep the costume and yet also refresh it and update it in an interesting way.
Definitely. They were really the Fantastic Four had a lot of really groundbreaking and not all good things going on in the costume.
That's right. Not all good. Yeah.
Like I can't help but think about Sue Storm's boob window costume from the 90s. That was
even as I was talking about them, I knew that you and I were both thinking of that costume because it was so bad, right? But if we're gonna talk about great costumes, like we have to hit like Magneto and Doctor Doom, right? That helmet, the Magneto helmet, is so brilliant because it gives you just enough to like see eyes and a snarl behind it, right? But it was also unusual and different enough. And that armor of Doctor Doom's, where it's both a medieval knight's armor and yet also with the green cape and notably, very important, the pistol on his hip, right? Which combined to create a really wonderfully, almost perfect costume.
And at the same time, Doom is also sort of the man in the Iron Mask, you know.
Yes, we'd get those shots, and you saw them sometimes. Again, this is another Byrne thing, although I don't think he was the first person to do it, but I remember very visually from Byrne's stories with Doom, where we would get a really tight close-up of Doom's face, or maybe just his eyes, and you could see through the rectangular eye slits the scars around his eyeballs, right? So you could tell that his face was melted, but you can only see this tiny little fraction of it from those rectangular eye slits. Yeah, great stuff.
So what do you make of Magneto's costume with the color theory? So like on the one hand he's bright red, but he's also purple at the same time. So what do you think the message is there that they're trying to say, that a misunderstood genius or somebody to watch out for?
Well, I mean, I think that Magneto's costume is designed to be contrary to the X-Men's team uniforms at the time, right? Because they're all wearing those yellow and blue team uniforms. Pretty straightforward. Notably, it's notable, I think, that the women of Marvel, with the sole exception of the Scarlet Witch, who starts off a villain, are all like head to toe clothed. Like, it's very in contrast to the swimsuit outfit of Wonder Woman and other characters that we have at DC. So Marvel Girl and Sue Storm and the Wasp, these people are all wearing complete outfits from their necks to their toes. That's not Magneto, but it occurs to me, and I don't think it's an accident, so I thought I would bring it up. But to get back to Magneto, his red and purple contrast with the blue and yellow of the X-Men. So if you've got, so like, well, okay, they're all blue and yellow. So what other color have we not used yet? Red. So we'll make him red, but then we'll add the purple to, because purple is, for some reason, it's the color of evil. I don't know why. Like I don't claim to know why this is, but I think that only because the way that those colors would have to get combined to create the purple, for some reason, maybe it was used less frequently, but a lot. The Toad's outfit, I think, was purple and orange. So yeah.
One possible thought on that is, historically, purple was considered the color of royalty.
That's right. Yeah.
So maybe it's that. Maybe they're trying to say something about the character of the villains.
Well, it works.
Yeah.
I mean, Magneto always worked that outfit pretty well, I thought.
I've always been in the, Magneto is just a misunderstood hero camp myself.
Well, he's a great example of a character who's he's simply been around so long that he's been used in many, many different ways. And so there's whole long storylines where you are exactly right, where he is a hero that's either maybe he's misunderstood or maybe he's repentant. In a lot of stories, he's playing a sort of ex-con role where he's the former villain who has now changed his ways, right? And this is part of what he's doing right now in the X-Men books, when I think he's wearing an all-white suit. But in other stories, and I think the early versions of Magneto are much simpler and less nuanced. He's a straight up bad guy. I mean, he's taking over Cape Canaveral and threatening to nuclear bomb, the United States. And it's tough to explain that away. But these were books that were written for a pretty, adolescent audience, and they weren't. There's also, I think, an experimental phase with a lot of these books, where Jack and Stan, they didn't really know what they had yet, quite frankly. And it wasn't until Claremont comes in and reinvents the X-Men and specifically makes Magneto Jewish, which he's not until that famous sequence with him and Kitty. And I forget which X-Men annual it is, but when he thinks that he's killed her. And we clarify that he is not only Jewish, but an Auschwitz survivor. And that goes a long way to redeeming the character, right? Like, yeah, he wants to make everybody sympathetic. He wants to make every character sympathetic, even the villains. And to his credit, I think that's interesting. It makes for an interesting story.
So, like, one series I've been rereading recently, just because, it's one of those things. Most of it's really cheap. You could pick up, like, the New Mutants on eBay, almost the whole series for, like, next to nothing. And
yeah.
I recommend that everybody who can do it does it, because it is some of the best Chris Claremont writing that you will ever read, especially those early issues of it.
The Demon Bear saga is great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Or, God, what was the name of that character? Oh, man, I am really bad with character names. Oh, it's such an easy name, too. I am stupid. I am so sorry. Who can suck people into his brain?
Yeah.
It's sort of alternate universe.
This is this the are you talking about Legion, the guy who is
That's the one.
Xavier's son?
That's the one.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I loved that story. It was just so much fun. It was some of the best, just weird, off-the-wall bonkers writing I've ever seen in an American
Yeah, good stuff. And you don't even have to buy them in back issues anymore. You can get Marvel Unlimited for like $10 a month and read all the comics you want. The entire run of New Mutants is on there. So
that's true, and they have all the issues that I'm missing, like all the first appearances.
And it's different to read a comic book online than to read it physically. And I don't just mean the experience of like physically having the book and the nostalgia. I mean like the way you physically read the comic is different. And that's a huge factor. That's got nothing to do with costumes, but if you think about what we were talking about earlier a few minutes ago about splash pages, well, when you have a comic book in front of you and the splash page, and that page is huge, and you can get into all the details, and you can look at all those characters. Now, imagine reading that same splash page on your phone. It's so tiny, and you can't see anything. Like all of the impact of the splash page is completely lost. And then think about the exact opposite. Imagine one of those panels that I was describing a minute ago with Dr. Doom, a really tight close-up, right? All you can see is like his eyes. Well, in a comic, that panel's not very large. It's very small and like one panel, right? But you read it on your phone, and it gets magnified to fill the entire screen. And now you can see all the bad art and all the imperfections of the lines and the dots and everything. Reading a comic on a screen is a very different experience and than reading the old original book.
I really like what the big three are doing with the guided reading experience.
Yeah.
I think it fundamentally changes how engaged I am with a comic book.
Well,
the reading sort of goes faster, but by the same token, I feel like it's more engaging. I find myself more sucked in than I used to be with paper.
Well, so here's my thoughts on guided. I use it too when I read comics online, but again, it changes the essential experience of how comic books work. Okay, let's think for a minute about a sequence. Let's say that you're reading a comic and you've got a one page in front of you, and the page is about a guy and he's like in his car and he's trying to beat a train, right? So he's like racing for the crossing, and the train is coming, and is he going to get across the crossing or not? On what panel of the page is the scene where he gets across the crossing or gets hit by the train? Where do we put that panel?
It's generally it's the last frame on the page or it's on the next page.
There you go. That's the answer, is that you don't put it on the page itself, because as you're reading the page, you'd be able to see it. You would, with your peripheral vision, you would see that resolution in the bottom corner, and you would know how the scene would end. Smart artist, the smart writer, does what's called a reveal. They take that image and they hide it on the back of the page so that you can't see how the story ends until you flip it. So now imagine that you're reading that same comic as a guided read online. Well, every single panel is the reveal. Like, there's no page anymore for your peripheral vision to scan, right? Every panel is from nowhere. This changes how a comic is read, which means it ought to change how the comic is made, right?
Exactly.
So, and I'm not saying anything that good comic artists don't already know, but my point is just that the way a comic is constructed structurally differs if you're making it to be read online as opposed to if you're making it to be read off the shelf.
How many times do you think there have been major shifts in the way comics think?
Well, I'm inclined to think that one of the major changes was the change to high quality paper and to digital printing processes. That is, the comics were still printed on paper, but we were now using digital printing techniques. And for example, this is why Marvel, I think, bought Malibu for this purpose. DC bought I can't remember what company they bought, but Marvel bought Malibu Comics, which had its own characters. It had, Mantra and Prime and a whole cast of characters, and they just ruined the company. They destroyed it in the following year. But that didn't matter because they got what they wanted, which was the copyrighted printing techniques that Malibu was using.
It never really destroyed Malibu, that though. I mean, the way I remember it, it really sounded like Malibu destroyed Malibu.
No,
observation to make.
I would strongly disagree. I loved some of those titles, but when Marvel took over, they suddenly Loki starts showing up in the Malibu verse, and all of the characters, like I was reading Mantra at the time, I remember, written by Mike Barr, a wonderful classic comic book writer who, but wrote a lot of Batman and the Outsiders in the old days, and wrote Son of the Demon, I think. He had to completely get rid of his main character and introduce a whole brand new primary character. Anyway, but that's a long story. So that was a lot of it. The shift to digital printing processes, the move to high quality paper. All of this, what this does is it makes the comic less of a disposable medium, where it costs like 75 cents to buy a comic book, and you read it and you throw it away, or you give it away to friends, or you just throw it in a corner. And it makes it into more of an expensive object that people want to collect or save. And this changes the whole relationship between the reader and the comic itself. That's fairly major. I mean, it doesn't show up in like the way that the comic is laid out on the page is the same. But when you saw and I'm thinking, for example, Dark Knight Returns, when those 4 issues first came out, they were square bound. They were like, prestige format books. And now that's an attempt to make comics high class. And this whole notion of what's popular art and what's high art is a very complicated question that many people would say has no meaning, that art is just art. But the way that we consume art is in many ways dependent on whether we see it as low art or high art, right? Going to the movies is low art. I'll spend $7.50 for a ticket. But going to the theater, going to a live stage play, that's high art. And a lot of people that will do one will never be caught dead doing the other, and vice versa. And so there was this move starting in, I think, with the direct sales market, right? With the fact that comics are no longer going to drugstores, or they're not only going to grocery stores, they're also going to specialty sales stores, where the comic starts to become less of a popular culture, low art, and more of an attempt to make it more high art. And then we get the whole shift to digital, and brought on by kind of largely a crisis in the whole industry. Sales are perpetually falling. Every generation, comics sell fewer comics than they sold before. What are we going to do? And one answer to that was an attempt to go to the trade paperback route, right? We'll sell the comic off of the bookshelf, and we'll collect 6 or 8 or 12 issues together, make them into a book, and we'll sell it for $25 off of the shelf. And that has the advantage of getting books onto the bookshelves where a lot of new people see them that would never go into a comic book store, right? But that got swamped by the Amazon online shopping, and so now the big push is the big push is into digital, and that's made much easier by the fact that ordinary people like you and like me, we can make comics digitally, and so web comics are a thing, right? They've been a thing for 15 years, 20 years, and that's put the power to make comics and distribute comics into the hands of ordinary people rather than only the publisher. So the gatekeepers are gone.
It's fantastic. It's totally blown away the barriers to entry.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wish I was 15 or 20 years younger. Because I was, and I was just coming into my own right now with all of my crazy comic book ideas I had when I was 15 and 16 years old. I wouldn't have tried to go to conventions and talk to people. What I would have done is gone straight to Comixology. Got the special creator account that they have, and uploaded my own stuff, which crazy enough puts it in the hands of millions of people. Comixology might as well be Marvel at this point.
Yeah. In fact, when I was teaching, one of the classes that I taught, our textbook was Comixology. I had all the students, rather than buying comics, we just all got a monthly subscription to Comixology, and we took all the comics that we read for the class off of that. which was great because assigning a bunch of comics can get very expensive to the students, right? Like, I mean, you can read a graphic novel pretty quickly. And so if I assign 6 or 8 or 12 graphic novels for the course, well, that's a pretty expensive price tag. And I was teaching in rural Georgia where, quite frankly, the students don't have that kind of money. But if I could get them into a couple of months of comicsology and we'd have all the comics that we wanted, that's a great way to go. I mean, other times when I was teaching, I taught a graphic novels course, and we did have a list of like six comic graphic novels that we did read because I wanted to read them physically. I wanted to be able to have all of us work through those documents as they were created. And not all of them were available on online services, you know. So if we're going to read, I mean, if I'm reading Watchmen, yes, I can get that online. But if I'm reading other books that were not as easy, like John Lewis's autobiography, March, for example, or if I'm reading a number of other, Fun Home is another good example. If we're reading Fun Home, these books aren't really available online in a good, reliable version. So we use the physical one.
Sure. I remember one that was really hard to track down online for the longest time was Mouse.
Sure, and I've taught Mouse many times. I had the virtue of being able to assign that one because it's been around so long and so many people have read it that they could get a used copy pretty quickly and easily. So, yeah.
That's pretty cool. What do you think the barriers are? I mean, I'm just curious. I imagine that, you know, comics being what they are and how they're perceived in culture, especially, you know, academic culture. Did you face any barriers to teaching comics as part of your course?
Well, occasionally, yes. Very seldom from within the English department. I think mostly English professors, liberal arts professors, people from the humanities understood that when you want to, that comics, I'm not here to say that all comics are great. Like there are plenty of terrible comic books, right, that are not worth spending 2 weeks of class time on. But there's plenty of novels and movies that aren't worth that either. There are comics that are as much deserving of the title of art or literature as anything else that we read. And sometimes I would get resistance. I remember when I first interviewed for my job at the rural college in Georgia where I ended up teaching, I was talking to the president of the college, and she said, "So you write about comic books?" And I said, "Yeah." And she laughed and she said, "Does anybody even read those anymore?" Now, in point of fact, the answer is almost no one, right? Like you and I read them, but a good selling comic book sells 30,000 copies. We live in a nation of 300 million people. Like that's a tiny percentage of Americans that buy Batman every month. So in some ways, she was right. But what she was really saying is that if people aren't reading it, it's not worth studying, which is stupid because very few people read Shakespeare anymore, but we still study that, right? Like that just because people right now today in America don't read comics doesn't mean it's not worth studying. Other
you know, by the same token, you can also look at novels. You know, the average novel, there are so many novels pumped out at this point that the average novel, I think the last time I looked at it, which was about 5 years ago, sold between 1,000 and 5,000 copies. That was considered success in the publishing industry.
For God's sakes, listen to popular songs. We know the most famous popular songs, but for every song that's a hit, there are literally 1,000 songs that go absolutely nowhere, right? But so for example, when I was teaching a class on comics, there's a lot of ways to get over that resistance. There's a tremendous academic scholarly background to comics research. that's been going on for more than 50 years. And so I could come loaded with academic books and names and people and programs. I mean, the University of Florida has a whole PhD program on sequential art, on comics. University of Chicago, and so when big universities like this are recognizing comics, it's much easier to convince your president of a little tiny rural college that it's worth studying, right? When Mouse wins the Pulitzer, well, that's a huge deal for legitimizing comics research. So when I taught comics, I started off with every single book on my syllabus had won a national award of some kind, right? So I'm teaching John Lewis's biography, which won the National Book Award, and I'm teaching Watchmen, which won like every comics award that there's an award for, and I'm teaching Sandman, which won the World Fantasy Award. I'm teaching specifically that story from Sandman, Midsummer Night's Dream, which was the only comic ever to win the World Fantasy Award, because after it won, they changed the rules so comics couldn't win anymore. Right?
It's crazy.
It is. It's crazy. But that's where I started. I started with books that had all won national awards, and I backed it all up with a lot of critical research. I mean, the library of comics scholarship, of the scholarly study of comics, is vast and international. We think of comics as kind of a junk art, or the average American might think of it as like, oh, that's just comic book talk. Like, that's something you throw away. But in Europe, the understanding of comics is completely different. I mean, the way that they think of, Tintin, for example, it's an art. It's an art form like any other. The French call it the ninth art. It's got long established artistic pedigrees. One of the challenges of studying comics in America is that for a very long time, we associated comics specifically with the genre of superheroes. And a lot of people mistakenly confuse those two things as being inextricably linked. If it's a comic book, it must be about a superhero. And if it's a superhero, they must be in a comic book. Well, of course, we know that's not true now. But 30 years ago, 40 years ago now, when Mouse came out, when Mouse was published, and for those of you that don't know what we're talking about Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning two-part graphic memoir, Mouse, which is about his parents' experiences in World War II as Auschwitz survivors. Well, when that book came out, the LA Review of Books, the LA Times, reviewed it and said, Art Spiegelman has invented a new art form. That is, this is not a comic book. Well, that's ridiculous. Of course it's a comic book. Art Spiegelman draws comics. You ask him, he'll tell you. But because it didn't have superheroes in it, the LA Times couldn't grok it as a comic book, right? Well, we've come a long way since then. But it took a long time for us to kind of get over that. And a lot of that has been seeing the opposite thing happen. Not so much that we've come to understand that comic books are not about superheroes, but we've actually come to see that superheroes are now no longer about comic books. Most 90% of Americans interact with superheroes in film, on television. They watch the CW every week, right? Or they watch Endgame, or they play the Arkham Asylum games or something. And that's how they get their superheroes. They play the new Marvel Avengers game on PlayStation or Xbox, and that's where they get their superheroes.
There's no shortage of you're absolutely right. And there's no shortage of superheroes in novels either. One of the best superhero stories I think I've ever read was a novel by April Daniels called Dreadnought. It was sort of about a superhero who is transgender. And I think doesn't make it any less or any less accessible than any other superhero story I've ever made. That's just sort of an element of the story. It's what drives the character forward, but
Yeah.
it's written language I think that anybody could identify with and understand. And I loved it. I read both of them back to back in like 4 days.
That's cool. I haven't read that. I taught a few superhero novels. I taught Soon I Will Be Invincible, which is a delightful story told from the villain's point of view. And I taught Michael Chabon's Pulitzer Prize winning novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. Which if you have not yet read it, you are in for a treat. It is a hell of a book. Chabon interviewed a lot of the pioneering greats of the comic art, including Kirby and Eisner and many others, before he wrote the book. And it's got kind of a thinly veiled Stan Lee, Jack Kirby pair of protagonists in the late 1930s, creating their own superhero in New York. And it gives us a wonderful kind of ground eye view of what that must have been like at that time. What was what were the founding days of the superhero genre like in America? And Chabon's a wonderfully sensitive writer with a wonderful handle for dialogue and plot. And it's a great book. It's long though, so give yourself some time. It's a hell of a read.
It's a very, very good book.
Yeah.
So what do you think your favorite superhero story of all time is? I mean, if you had to pick one.
It's really hard. I think like a lot of people that do a lot of superhero work, I go through phases. When I was a kid, like Spider-Man was the man, right? Like it was Spider-Man 24 hours a day. I had like the web shooter toys. I had the Spider-Mobile. Like I read his comic voraciously every month. I bought Peter Parker as soon as it came out, the first issue of that. I was real big into Spider-Man. But as I aged, different characters, I began to be interested in creators more than the characters that they were making, and I would follow somebody from title to title or company to company to see what they did. As I became an academic, I came to appreciate some of the genius behind a lot of characters that were created long before I was born. The original Captain Marvel that I'm talking about, the Shazam guy here, there is a certain genius to Captain Marvel. He's a kid, which means that the audience can identify with him. Most superhero stories are written for kids. He's a kid. His parents are missing. But he does the thing that every kid wishes they could do, which is instantly turn into a grown-up, right? And the power to be a grown-up is a metaphor. All these superheroes are metaphors. When you're a kid, grown-ups are superpowered. They're superhuman. They can do everything. I remember trying to arm wrestle my dad, and I am 8 years old trying to arm wrestle my dad, right? And he just seems so impossibly strong. And then not only does Billy turn and say a magic word and turn into a grown-up, but we find out years later by other writers come in and they retcon that so that when he turns into a grown-up, the grown-up he turns into is exactly what his father looks like, the father he never knew. Well, of course, that's brilliant, right? I mean, it's brilliant. He turns into the father he never knew. I've come to appreciate all of these characters, but they have, if they're well written. Well, I think as a lot of us can tell, I have seen with our own eyes, a great character in superhero comics can also be ruined by a terrible writer, but a bad character can also really be elevated. And I live for those stories. I love those where a character gets just really something really fresh and human, and you sympathize with them. But if I have to list a bunch of other favorites, I've always been partial to Aquaman. He gets he got a lot of jokes before Jason Momoa got cast. And you talk about perfect casting. Like if you ever wanted to make a character that everybody used to laugh at and suddenly make him cool. Just get Jason Momoa to play him, right? And now he's so cool.
I feel like I talk about Shazam in every episode, but Otto Bender, I think, just in general, is one of my favorites. So he's like the quintessential early Silver Age comic book writer.
Yeah.
Like in Shazam, he gives us, this ridiculously overpowered villain who just happens to be a caterpillar.
Yeah, Mr. Mind. There's wonderful creativity in those books, and they often aren't written very well or whatever. But what I love about that early era of superhero comic is when the writers were clearly experimenting and they were just sort of trying every new thing, and a lot of the things that we now assume as rules of the superhero genre hadn't really been figured out back then. And so there's maybe a little bit more experimentation, and it didn't always work. It often didn't work, but you respect them for trying. And sometimes, like if you read the early Jack Kirby, Joe Simon, Captain Americas, you can see Jack Kirby learning how to draw page by page, right? Like you can see him learning how layout works. When he'll try something crazy, like some layout where the panels like go in the wrong direction or whatever, and you can see him try it and then learn from that and never make that mistake again, and it's really educational.
Yeah, Ditko did the same thing. Some of those Ditko layouts were so confusing because they literally had to draw arrows on the page. So
That's right. The arrow,
pages were supposed to go.
Yeah.
Oh boy, that was a heck of an era in comics. Just seeing those guys in their prime, I think. So what do you think of, just in general, and tell me if I'm out of bounds here. I will respect your thoughts there. But what do you think of the politics in comics? Do you feel like the politics of comics have always been kind of static, or do you feel like they've changed over the years and continue to evolve?
Well, I think that the politics in comics are representations of their time. That is, think back to like when Superman first shows up, and you know all this. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But when Superman first appears, he's like fighting for the little guy, right? Like he's fighting for coal miners and making the owner of the mine swing the tool in his own mine and breathe the coal dust. He's going to the mayor and threatening the mayor in his own house and saying, if you don't fix this, I'm going to come back and you're going to be sorry, right? Like he was an anti-establishment, pro-working class guy. And a lot of these stories were very rebellious and very much siding with, what we would today call very liberal, progressive values. But as the country became more conservative in the 50s, comics reflected that and became more conservative too. So now, instead of Captain America, we get Captain America, Commie Smasher, right? Which is like 4 issues of Captain America in the 1950s, and it flopped. People didn't want to read it. But if you read those comics, the depiction of Captain America is so bad that eventually Marvel retconned the story, so it wasn't Captain America at all. It was another guy impersonating Captain America, right? But I think that a lot of these comics were created in New York, often by people with very progressive or liberal backgrounds, often from oppressed minorities, and I'm thinking about so many comics created by people with Jewish roots. And they were very sensitive to the discrimination that they saw in the street every day. And we get that amazing panel by Denny O'Neil, right, with Green Lantern, confronted by an old black man on the street that says, hey, I've heard you've done all kinds of great things for the purple skins and the orange skins and the blue skins, but what have you ever done for the black skins? And of course, Green Lantern's answer is nothing. Yeah, and Denny O'Neil, who I got a chance to talk to before his tragic passing, he acknowledged that that's probably the most famous panel he'll ever write, which is crazy for a guy who wrote so much. Like the guy who wrote the Batman Bible, who basically supervised Batman for a decade, But he'll always be famous for that panel. And that starts off this whole kind of introspective, hard traveling heroes phase where you've got Green Arrow as the hippie and Green Lantern as the super cop. And of course the cop is wrong at every phase. It's all about making him question his beliefs. Well, today in our Black Lives Matter environment, those stories are more relevant than ever. You know?
Oh yeah.
Well, anyway, so I think that comics have often been very liberal, and I think that people that say that you should take the politics out of comics, like I don't know what comics they've been reading, because there have always been politics in comics, and that's where I learned that you treat people the way you want to be treated, and that you got to look out for the little guy. I mean, that's where we learn these things, you know, when we're 6 or 8 or 12 years old. And when Ms. Marvel, I mean, what a classic example of this, right? Ms. Marvel, she's created in the 70s. Her name is Ms. Marvel, which nowadays we don't think about it, but that was a huge issue at the time. The Equal Rights Amendment was the talk of the town, and Ms. was specifically a feminist title. It's something that you chose because I'm not a miss, I'm not a little girl, and I'm not a Mrs. I'm not married to somebody. I'm an independent woman. And we had Ms. Magazine, run by Gloria Steinem, and the cover of Ms. Magazine #1 had Wonder Woman on it running for president, right? Well, what was Ms. Marvel's secret identity? She was a writer for a women's magazine. She was Gloria Steinem in tights, which was awesome. And of course now she's Captain Marvel and has her own movie. And you ditch the Ms. because she's just Captain now, and that's a wonderful transition for that character. But that did not happen without a lot of effort, right? Like Marvel Bendis is working at Marvel at the time, and he hires, I can't believe I've forgotten her name, to write Captain Marvel's comic and update that character. And the first thing you have to deal with when you deal with Ms. Marvel is what are we going to call her? What's her name? Because Ms. is terribly dated to us now. It feels like a relic of the 70s. And when Kurt Busiek had this problem, he writes her, he loves the character. He wants to put Carol in the Avengers, but he can't use Ms. Marvel. So they actually make a scene out of it where like she's there with the Beast, like brainstorming what her name should be. And I think they come up with Warbird, which isn't a bad name, but it's not her name. Well, so finally the writer of her own title knows that the proper name for her is Captain Marvel, especially when we don't have a Captain Marvel at the moment. So she gets promoted, and now the title is hers. Well, these are very progressive values, and there's a reason for all this. A lot of this we like to think that our writers are doing this because they're all enlightened people and they're all just, well, maybe, because a lot of it is sheer acknowledgement of the fact that we can't sell comic books if our only audience is aging straight white dudes, right? Like we have to, there's more people in the universe. And if we want them to buy our comics, we've got to start making comics that they can relate to. And so we need to have some people of color, and we need to have women, and we need to have people with different sexual orientations and different religious beliefs, right? So we get a character like Kamala Khan, the other Ms. Marvel, right? Who's like a 16-year-old Palestinian, Pakistani American, and a Muslim. That's crazy talk. Can you imagine? But it's also interestingly parallel to what we had in, I think it was in the 80s, when we had Monica Rambeau as Captain Marvel.
People forget about that one.
Well, you shouldn't forget about her, because think about for a minute how courageous it was, how brave it was for Marvel Comics in the 1980s, 79, 80, I forget when she first debuted, to create a character named after the company. She is Captain Marvel, and she is a black woman superhero. That took guts. Like, I respect that. And they took it away Marvel got cold feet, and they gave that title to another. They brought back the old Captain Marvel again, and they made it his son, and they, now she's named Photon or something ridiculous like that. But when the decision was originally made, it was quite gutsy, and the sad thing about it is that they changed their mind.
I loved her costume. She had remember, I'm thinking about the one Monica Rambeau, Captain Marvel, circa 1988, 1989.
Yeah.
The black and white thing.
Yeah, the black and white suit was great. And I remember reading about her debut, and was it Stern? I forget who created the character. And he revealed her at a Comic-Con. It might have even been San Diego Comic-Con. This is, long ago, before Comic-Cons were as big as they are now. And he said she's a black woman and she's from New Orleans. And some guy jumps up and says, does she have voodoo powers? because they associate New Orleans with only one thing, right? But no, she doesn't have voodoo powers. She's not like, that would have been a very racially based superpower set to have, right? Like, that would have been like a very stereotypically black thing for her to have. Like Black Talon, who was a black villain with voodoo powers. But instead, she has powers completely unrelated to that. And her costume is not about that. She's not Captain Voodoo. She's Captain Marvel. And she's got these amazing energy powers. And she was a great character. She still is a great character. And if she can't have the name, then I'm glad that they gave it to Carol and that character. They've made that character into, the whole phenomenon that we have today, which is great. Long answer to a short question on politics and comics.
Oh my God, no! I'm having so much fun here.
Good.
Okay, so going back to one of the things that you said earlier about creating comics with more diversity in the aim of creating or targeting new audiences. Do you feel that? Do you feel like they're doing enough? Do you feel like they're doing it right at this point? Does Marvel and DC, or even for that matter, have a ways to go, or where's the equilibrium?
Well, I mean, let's be honest. There's always going to be a long ways to go, right? Like, this is a never-ending battle, but we're superheroes. We're used to these never-ending battles, right? Like, just because we got a long way to go doesn't mean it's not worth doing. Now, let's go back to like Denny O'Neil and the other white creators at Marvel and DC who were trying to create progressive liberal characters in the 70s. We get somebody like Luke Cage, right? Power Man. And Power Man he's a black character, and he's a superhero, and he's got his own book, but he's an ex-convict, which is bad, right? Like, this association of black characters with being criminals, that's bad. He's got like that ridiculous like yellow deep V-shirted V-neck shirt which my old friend Jerry Grayson, who's now a game creator and comics maker of his own, he used to always call that the pimp shirt, and he's not wrong, right? So he's throwing out these terrible phrases like "Sweet Christmas." The writers on those books, they wanted to make the black characters sound authentic, but the writers had no idea what authentic black New Yorkers actually sounded like. They didn't know what Harlem sounded like. And so they tried to just make it up. They knew it wasn't right, but they just tried to make it up and make it sound cool. And of course now we read it and it's just hilariously bad. But they were trying, right? Like, their hearts were in the right place, but they were creatures of their time, as we are also creatures of our time. So now we're getting much more nuanced presentations of these characters. We got more black creators, people of color, more women in the field than ever before, making characters, making stories, artists, and also a lot of them operating behind the scenes. A lot of people forget that the the woman, the person who lettered virtually everything DC put out for 20 years was a woman, and I forget her name, but she was a legend in the industry, and she lettered everything, but she wasn't the artist and she wasn't the writer or the editor, and so we forget them. We forget the people that made these contributions. And one day when we have time, we should go back and talk about when you asked much earlier in our conversation about technical changes to the way comics were made. Well, the shift from hand lettering to computerized lettering using a font has been huge for the way that comics get made. And now you hire somebody like Comic Craft to letter every comic you put out. And it's a very, very different art than it used to be. But that's another story. There's a long way still to go. But and every time it seems like we take a big step forward, we end up getting kicked and taking half of a step back. And I'm thinking specifically of the Milestone comics. You remember Milestone, Dwayne McDuffie's. Yeah, amazing work. He was just a leader of a company that had employed black writers, black artists, black editors. Dennis Cohen, among one of many, and they created characters like Static and Icon and so many others. But the sales were not there at the time, and the company maybe expanded a little bit too quickly. And Dwayne McDuffie himself dies tragically young must be almost 20 years ago now. But those characters are still around, and DC is bringing them back. We're getting Milestones coming back again. We don't know what it's going to look like yet. The books aren't out yet, but it's good that they're doing that. But we should never lose sight that a lot of DC and Marvel's reason for doing this is not always because they think it's the right thing to do. It's because they think that there's money in it. Well, let's hope they're right. And you got to marry the two things. You got to take the desire to make money to reach a new audience, but you have to couple that with a creator who actually gives a shit, right?
Right.
So let's take a female writer and give her a character like Captain Marvel, or let's take a black writer and give them somebody like Miles Morales, and let's let them tell a story that's relevant, that black or female readers can see themselves in, and then let Marvel and DC worry about making a success out of it, right? Let them worry about the marketing and the publishing and the dollars, and let the creators do their thing for the right reasons. And I'm often very skeptical of capitalism in the 21st century, but it can be done right with care.
Do you think that do you think it's cynical to just kind of assume that anything these giant corporations that own Marvel and DC are going to do is going to be about money rather than the creative or the art form side of it?
Well, I mean, as the more I've come to study comics, the more I've become convinced that the way the comic is physically made determines the story itself. That is, the medium becomes the message, or in another way of describing this is the means of production. And I wish that wasn't true. But we've also, even in our conversation tonight, we've talked about ways that it's not true. A lot of the gatekeepers are down. So if an independent person just out there who's listening to this podcast, if some 16-year-old wonderkind out there wants to make a new comic about a new superhero, and that person is from a group that's traditionally been underrepresented in comics, maybe they're gay, or maybe they're Muslim, or maybe they're black or brown or whatever, and they want to make a character that they can identify with. They want to draw themselves into a comic. Well, they can do that now. They can do that, and they can draw those pages, and they won't even be pages anymore, right? They'll probably almost entirely digital. They'll draw that whole thing on their tablet, and they'll upload that comic to Comixology or Amazon, and they'll sell it, and or maybe they won't sell it. Maybe that doesn't matter to them. Maybe they just want to make it. They don't even care if it sells. But the big companies have all of these very well-known intellectual properties, right? Like they have the Batmans and the Spider-Mans, and when they have those names, that's a huge, well, it's the power of responsibility, right? You have this huge power now. How are you going to use it? And sometimes that power is used well, and I love, like, for example, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films. I think they have a lot of heart. I think, but then sometimes that power is used very cheaply, and the character is just there it's just kind of exploitive, and it's just another way to get, a movie ticket out of you. So I think you kind of have to couple somebody who really cares about these characters. I remember when Jon Favreau directed the original Iron Man movie, and Favreau, who now is doing The Mandalorian and a million other things, but he really loved that character, and he loved comics, and he tried to give that character some humanity and some identity. We don't remember this now because Iron Man, the films are so huge, but Iron Man was kind of a tough selling comic back then. Like, not a lot of people read it. He was a major character. He was on the Avengers, and he had his own title that had been going on since '63 or whatever. But he wasn't a very big seller. And that was one of the reasons why Marvel still had the rights to him. Because, of course, they'd sold the rights to Spider-Man, to the X-Men, to the Fantastic Four. They'd sold all those characters, but they still had all of their second and third string characters. And that's why we got Iron Man, right? But then they cast Robert Downey Jr., who comes in and makes that character come to life. And Favreau tells a story that grabs you and creates sympathy, and it worked. It creates the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe, and then skip forward to almost the end of that whole sequel, and we get Black Panther, right? Which is directed by a Black American and about a Black superhero, and it deals specifically with Blackness in America. I mean, when the bad guy, I can't remember, I've forgotten his name, King, when the antagonist of that movie says the sun will never set on the Wakandan Empire, he's quoting the British Empire, right? That was a colonial empire. And that whole movie becomes about race issues. It's a movie about race. So what you have is kind of this giant firepower, this weapon with enormous firepower, and then you have to hope that Marvel and DC give that firepower to a creative team that uses it responsibly, right? And not somebody like Zack Snyder to take a just pure hit right there, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Zack Snyder is an example of a guy who makes movies about characters he hates. He clearly thinks that Superman is a terrible superhero because Superman fucks up in every movie that he's in. And he fails to save people. He's a very dysfunctional and failing superhero. So that's a bad call on the part of DC. Will they do better? I don't know, maybe. Sometimes they do. The Wonder Woman films are a positive example. The Shazam movie was better.
I liked the Shazam movie a lot.
Yeah, it was fun. I liked it. I'm waiting too long for the sequel. I wanted that movie last year, right? Those kids, the kids that were playing, the family, they're growing up way too fast for us to be waiting 4 years for a sequel.
That's true.
Yeah. Anyway, long answer.
No, it's great. I'm really enjoying this talk.
Good.
The long answers are totally fine. You don't have to apologize for that.
Okay, fair enough.
What do you think comics give us? Why do people love them the way they do?
Well, there is something now. This experience is different with every generation because different generations read comic books in different ways. But imagine to when you were first reading your first comic book. There's nothing quite like it because it's visual, so it's like a movie. But you watch it by yourself, so it's not like a movie, right? Where you're in a huge room full of people, or even watching the television with your family. But unlike the television, you can interact with it. Like you need to interact with it. You not only do you physically have to turn the page, but you have to connect the dots from panel to panel. Those of you that are at Scott McCloud know he calls this effect closure. That is, every panel of a comic is missing the action that happens in the gutter, the space between the panels. And you're the one that has to connect the panel 1 with panel 2. And all the action in between that happens in between panel 1 and panel 2, you have to add. And so comics are a uniquely interactive art form. They require the reader to participate to make the story work. You have to connect those panels. You have to turn books make you turn the pages, but books aren't the same. Like the book tells you what's going on and you imagine it in your head. That's participatory. But it doesn't require you to do that in the way that a comic does. Comics don't work without the reader filling in the dots. And then the colors and the stories, often it can feel demeaning to the genre for us to say that comics, superhero comics especially, are primarily written for adolescents. Now, there's a lot of exceptions. We all know them. There's a whole industry of exceptions. But at their heart, superheroes are written for kids. And they're designed to teach us things. How to behave, how to treat other people, when to be afraid and when to be brave. That we can succeed when things are hard, often through the help of our friends or our family. You know, when Peter has to go out and take pictures of Spider-Man so that he can buy medicine for his Aunt May. I mean, he's a role model. Peter's a role model, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you're 12 years old and you're reading about Peter, he's in high school or maybe he's just starting college. He's not so old that you can't imagine yourself being him. There's a secret to young adult literature that the audience for a young adult novel is always just a few years younger than the character in the novel, because kids don't want to read about people their own age. They want to read about people just a little bit older than them, right? Yeah, so it was with Peter, and so there's something unique about the physical way that comics function in the brain, the way that you read them. There's something appealing about the characters and the sheer brightness of the story and the pages. And also, I don't think it's irrelevant that these characters are symbols. They're metaphors, right? And every great superhero writer has understood this, that they're metaphors. When you've got a character that's walking around and he's walking around New York City, but he's lost. Well, he's just a guy lost in New York City. But when you put him in a red, white, blue uniform and you put a white A on his forehead, well, now he's America lost in New York City, right? And suddenly the story means something. When you've got a kid who says a magic word and gets superpowers, okay. But when he turns into a grown-up, that's all of our wish fulfillments. We all want to be grown-ups when we're little, right? We want to go the places that grown-ups get to go that kids don't get to go. We want to do the things that grown-ups get to do. We all want to be Tom Hanks in Big, right? or whatever, whatever the modern version is. And so these symbols speak to us, even if we don't consciously realize what the symbols represent. Back 400 years ago, Spencer is writing the introduction to Edmund Spencer is writing the introduction to his book, The Fairy Queen. Now, The Fairy Queen is a immensely long poem. It's incredibly allegorical and hard to understand. But at the beginning of the book, he's explaining how it works. And he says, look, there's basically two ways to learn. Or I should say, two ways to teach. You can stand up in front of everybody and you can lecture them. And you can make them all memorize what you're saying. Or you can teach by example. And that's so much more fun. And that's why we read these stories. We read these stories so that they teach us, but we're having so much fun reading them, we don't even realize that we're being taught. Right? We're just seeing what good people do. And when good people do good things, the universe rewards them. And when they make a mistake and they do bad things, the universe punishes them. And Peter Parker is a great example of this, right? He gets carried away by his fame. He starts looking out for the money, and he forgets about what's important. And pretty soon, he's holding his dead uncle in his hands, right? And he finds the guy, and the guy is the one who killed his uncle, and he says, it's all my fault. Okay, it's not his fault. He didn't pull the trigger, but his incredibly overdeveloped sense of responsibility shows him that he was wrong. He did something wrong, and the universe punished him for it, right? And this is how we learn. And I think that comics are really, really good at this. There's later generations and more mature writers have taken comics in more mature directions. So they're not written for children anymore. They're not there to teach us like that anymore. But instead they become literature on another form. They become visual literature, graphic literature that is still engaging, still asking tough questions, showing us the human condition, and often these days making us examine superheroes and comics themselves. So we get superhero stories, which are in many ways about superhero stories like Watchmen and the many, many sequels that have come out after it, where they're really asking us, they rely on our own nostalgia for comics to work. An ordinary person doesn't really get much out of Watchmen because they don't get everything that the whole 30 years, 40 years of superhero history that Watchmen is trying to tap. Anyway, it's an evolving medium, but I think that's why comics work so well on us, specifically when we're kids.
Interesting. So, Jason, or rather, Doctor, do you prefer Doctor or Jason?
Oh, please. Jason is fine. Jason
okay.
Is fine.
Sorry, I've been using both this whole time, and I feel terrible. Anyway, it has been an absolute pleasure having you just sit with me tonight and talk about comics and how much fun, and just go through some of the history. One more question, and then I'm going to wrap up. If you were a superhero, what would your costume look like?
Oh, I thought you guys knew what my powers would be, because that would be weather control. I would totally control the weather.
That would be fun too.
Yeah, because so my last name, Tondro, Tondro, in the language of Esperanto, Tondro means thunder. So I could be Dr. Thunder.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, that's not bad. But the costume is the tough part, because I don't exactly have the superhero physique that I used to have, right? So it's going to have to be a little slimming, I think. So I don't know. I might, the safe route would be like that. Like when we talk about costumes, think about like the way that costumes have evolved for superheroes in film. The first really successful. Well, okay, so first you have Superman back in 77, right? You have the Christopher Reeve Superman movie, and that's a hit. But But Hollywood has a real hard time duplicating that for a very long time. And Blade was successful, but that wasn't really a superhero movie. It was more like a martial arts horror movie than it was a superhero film. The first really successful modern superhero film is Bryan Singer's X-Men. And they're all just wearing black suits and trench coats straight out of the Matrix, right? They look like they all walked off the Matrix set. And they're so conscientious, they're so nervous, there's so much anxiety about the superhero costume in that movie that they even make fun of it. If you remember, that's the movie where Logan jokes, "What do you want me to do? Wear yellow spandex?" Right? 10 years later, when X-Men Days of Future Past comes out, Wolverine's wearing fucking yellow spandex, right? But that's the evolution of the superhero costume. So as audiences watch these movies enough, they get used to the idea of the superhero costume, and Hollywood gets less anxious about it until they embrace it. And then the physical way that the costume looks changes thanks to stuff like high definition. You know, like now, if you show an old superhero costume on a high def television, it just looks boring. It's just this huge expanse of blue, right? It looks like tights. You can see the spandex. Well, so how do they solve that? Well, they make those costumes incredibly detailed, far more detailed than they'd ever be drawn in a comic book, right? Think back to how we started this conversation when you asked me about the early costumes, where it was speed and bad resolution was the determining factors. But now you get an outfit like Doctor Strange's outfit or Black Panther's outfit, and those things are incredibly detailed. Superman's last costume was like a mesh of Superman shields, like thousands of tiny Superman shields, so small they were like individual scales on scale mail, right? Like it was almost like it was a suit of armor made up of tiny little Superman symbols. And that's only possible because of the incredible resolution and definition of our home movie screens. So it's really interesting to me how the changing technology of entertainment, of film and television, has determined how these costumes get made. So I am smart enough to go to a costume designer and say, whatever you want to do, just make me look cool.
There you go.
And put my trust in the experts.
That is really cool. Well, Jason, it has been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure indeed. It's a real privilege to be on your show.
And that's our show. Isn't Jason amazing? Don't forget to check him out on Twitter at Dr. Comics, and links to his work can be found in the description on our website and YouTube. Join us next time as we bring back the beautiful and talented Ren Chandler. And we're going to nerd out about stuff, mainly comics, but it's going to be a ton of fun. Titular Characters is produced by me, the adorable Eva Webb, and available at podcast.evaweb.me. The cover art for this episode was created by Alexiva, and she is super talented. The bumper music is Superhero by Tim McMorris. So that's it, I guess. Come again. And when you do, bring candy.